Hello. Last episode, I discussed the three prime reasons why we saw Israel launch the recent attack that it did against Iran. Firstly, the ruling by the International Atomic Energy Agency concluded that Iran wasn't sticking to its nuclear obligations, and this gave Israel one of the reasons that it believed that it needed to attack. Netanyahu was also incentivized personally to pursue war with Iran to uphold his coalition. And finally, Israel is in pursuit of regime change in Iran, as we've seen by Netanyahu's rhetoric since the start of this conflict. However, on top of this, there is still much more to discuss. Firstly, we have to consider the big picture view of this conflict, framed through the previous tit-for-tat interactions that we saw between Israel and Iran in April 2024 and in October 2024. Today, we're also going to assess the impact on the oil industry, the collapse of the U.S. Iran nuclear deal, and the potential for active US involvement in this conflict between Israel and Iran. So, let's dive in. To put this latest conflict into perspective, it does make sense to return to the previous tit-for-tat that we saw unfold between Israel and Iran. As a reminder, on the 1st of April 2024, Israel bombed an Iranian consulate building in Damascus, killing a number of Iranian officials and IRGC generals. In response, on April 13th, Iran launched strikes towards Israel in collaboration with Islamic resistance in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen. This Iranian response was named Operation True Promise, of which today we are seeing the third iteration of this unfold. This Iranian response back in April 2024 involved 170 drones, 30 cruise missiles, and 120 ballistic missiles, many of which were shot down by Israel with the help of the Americans, the British, the French, and the Jordanian air forces. It is worth noting that Jordan's involvement was to defend against objects that were flying through its own airspace, and this is a stance that they have maintained with this latest escalation between Israel and Iran. After this Iranian response, back in April 2024, they stated that the attacks can be deemed, quote, concluded, in their opinion. So the rhetoric here, despite being a series of unprecedented attacks between Israel and Iran, was de-escalatory in nature. On April 19th, Israel launched strikes at an air defense facility near Isfahan in Iran. Satellite images suggested that this attack destroyed an Iranian S-300 PMU-2, which is a surface-to-air missile defense system. But most importantly, these strikes were limited, and the Iranians continued to pursue de-escalation in the aftermath of this attack from the Israelis. The Iranians stated that any explosions that were heard were in defense against Israeli drones, and that no attack had hit. Regardless of the truth behind the damage caused by this Israeli attack, both sides were clearly seeking de-escalation. When Israel responded with this reduced level of attack, the Iranians laughed off this attack as weak and hence decided not to respond to it. When we view these events from April 2024 in their totality, we can see that we were clearly in an environment of de-escalation. Moving on to October 2024, and this is when we saw Iran launch Operation True Promise 2, which involved 200 ballistic missiles in 2 waves, targeting military assets in Israel. From the Iranian point of view, this was in response to Israel's spree of assassinations in the months prior, which had seen them take out Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh while he was in Tehran, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, and IRGC General Abbas Nilfarushan. In September, we'd also seen Hezbollah dramatically weakened via the pager explosions, as Israel had somehow had access to Hezbollah communication devices and had rigged them with explosives. Analysts saw this October Iranian attack as Iran hoping to save face after it had been severely weakened by Israel's moves over the months prior, especially via the moves the Israelis had made against Hezbollah. This Iranian attack in October saw the Israeli air defences more overwhelmed than in the April attack, but again, there wasn't extensive damage caused. Once again, the United States and Jordan were reported to be involved in intercepting missiles, and the largest hit area of the Iranian attack was the Nevatim air base in Israel. Israel waited until October 26th to respond. This was another de-escalatory measure that used time to reduce the likelihood of an escalatory spiral forming. Israel launched 3 waves of strikes against Iran, Iraq, and Syria, but they told Iran beforehand what they would be targeting. In the build-up to this attack, we also saw leaked US intelligence documents that detailed Israel's preparations. The Israeli targets largely included Iranian military assets, specifically air defense systems and factories. The biggest takeaway here is that this attack reportedly destroyed all of Iran's long-range surface-to-air missile batteries and long-range detection radars. With this strategy of targeting Iran's air defense capabilities, it's worth considering if April 2024 and October 2024 were directly related to the recent events that we've seen in the last few weeks. Yes, both April 2024 and October 2024 were de-escalatory in nature, but they also both contributed to Iran's weakened air defensive capabilities, which have allowed Israel a level of success in its strikes against Iran in this last week. In October 2024, both officials from the United States and Israel stated that most of Iran's air defense network had been destroyed in the aftermath of these attacks, and importantly, that this would pave the way for potential future Israeli attacks. So, this had likely always been the plan, but when the International Atomic Energy Agency ruling and Netanyahu's potential coalition collapse emerged, the stars aligned for the Israelis, and they had to take advantage of Iran's lack of air defense and the environment that they had created through the previous operations back in April 2024 and October 2024. So we now understand that the previous tit-for-tat between Israel and Iran was very likely preparation for the conflict that we are in today. Now that this has arrived, it's worth considering the consequences of such a war. And when discussing any conflict in the Middle East, it's always worth discussing crude oil. So what impact will be seen here? And is there any substance to the discussions surrounding the Strait of Hormuz and a potential blockade? Since the start of this conflict last week, we have seen multiple acts of aggression against the oil and gas sectors in both Israel and Iran. We saw Israel hit Iran's South Pars gas field last Saturday, and they also struck the Sharan oil depot near Tehran. In response, Iran has attacked the Haifa oil refinery. Also related to this conflict, vessels in the Strait of Hormuz have been reporting electronic interference, which is affecting vessel positioning reporting. This could potentially be a smokescreen for Iran or other Middle Eastern states to relocate their assets in the Gulf, but it is a point that is worth noting. So, the Strait of Hormuz is a strait that sits between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. It is one of the world's most important strategic choke points because any disruption there would severely damage global energy trade. 20% of global crude oil flows through the strait, as well as close to 20% of global demand for liquefied natural gas, which mainly comes from Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. Blocking such energy flows from entering the global market would have dire effects, especially seen via upward pressure on the prices of crude oil and natural gas. Despite the impact that this would have, in the last few days, some Iranian officials have discussed the potential of limiting transport throughout the Strait of Hormuz. So, the biggest question here is this a valid strategy that we could see the Iranians pursue? The simple answer to this question is that if Iran decided to shut the Strait of Hormuz, they would also be harming themselves. This brings us to an important point, which is where Iran's biggest energy facilities sit. Firstly, there is Karg Island. This is Iran's primary oil export terminal, and it handles over 90% of its crude oil exports. There is also a facility in Jask. This terminal is connected to a 1,000-kilometre pipeline from Gure, which allows Iran to export directly into the Arabian Sea. And finally, the Gure oil terminal is the start point for crude transfers from inland areas that eventually end up in Jask, where they can be exported to the wider world. If Iran was to close the Strait of Hormuz, they would block Karg Island into the Persian Gulf, and 90% of their crude oil exports wouldn't be able to leave. So, although blocking the Strait of Hormuz is an interesting scenario to consider, due to the negative impact it would have on Iran, it's not a scenario that I can see unfolding today in the current environment that we are in this war. Another point to support this scenario not unfolding is that if such a strategy was pursued, this likely wouldn't hurt Israel at all, because most of Israel's energy imports, such as those from the United States and Azerbaijan, don't even navigate the Strait of Hormuz. The only scenario where I could see the Strait of Hormuz potentially being blocked is where the pain that such a move would cause Iran's adversaries would outweigh the negative cost to Iran. This could occur if Iran's exports fell to incredibly low levels, so the economic cost of blocking the strait would be quite low. But this again raises the issue of who blocking the Strait of Hormuz would cause pain to. India imports close to 90% of its crude oil, and 40% of this comes from the Persian Gulf, so it would hurt India. China is also a large buyer of Iranian exports of crude oil, and so this would also hurt China. Finally, it would hurt the other Gulf states, who would experience reduced exports through the Persian Gulf. This move would anger the nations in the Middle East who currently are remaining rather silent on this war that is unfolding between Israel and Iran. So, to summarise, Iran would hurt itself economically if it blocked the Strait of Hormuz. If there was no economic damage that would occur to Iran, they would hurt nations that possess somewhat positive relations with them. Hence, Iran will not block the Strait of Hormuz unless as a last resort. So moving on to Israel and their energy facilities. And we've seen both the Leviathan and Karish natural gas fields shut, which has essentially closed 2/3 of Israel's gas production overnight. Their other field, the Tamar field, does continue to operate. Also, the Haifa oil refinery was shut down in the aftermath of the Iranian attack a few days ago. The impacts of this could see Israel pivot to other sources of fuel, such as coal. but they are backed by the United States, who is the world's largest oil producer, and so Israel will likely move forward even without these energy facilities in operation. So, looking forward from here, expect crude oil prices to remain volatile. They have already spiked up into the $70 to $80 range in the aftermath of the start of this conflict, but the attacks on energy infrastructure will continue to provide some upwards pressure to price. However, on the flip side, OPEC Plus have been boosting production in recent months, which, if they repeat in the future, would place downward pressure on crude oil prices. So expect volatility in the crude oil markets, but the direction that price moves is yet to be determined. So moving on now, before we saw this escalation, there did seem to be a potential solution to the worries surrounding Iran's nuclear ambitions. This is, of course, referring to the U.S. Iran nuclear talks that we saw unfold over the last few months. The next question that emerges is, how did these nuclear talks fall apart? And what is the likelihood that we may see a deal return to? So, in the aftermath of the recent attacks by Israel, Iran stated that talks were now meaningless with the United States. But even when the talks were unfolding, we saw a clear difference on both sides on the topic of nuclear enrichment. And so, without a change in demand occurring from one side or the other, these talks likely weren't going to lead anywhere. Trump and the United States wanted no Iranian enrichment. However, with Iran's energy crisis, they needed some enrichment domestically, especially with Russia planning to aid in the construction of 8 new nuclear power plants in Iran. The United States was happy to have Iran import enriched uranium, but from a self-interest point of view, Iran wouldn't accept this. Because if the United States suddenly pulled out of the deal, Iran would need its own supply to fulfill its needs, regardless of whether these needs were for peaceful purposes or not. Today, on Friday the 20th of June, we are seeing some talks occur, this time between the Europeans and Iran in Geneva, where they will discuss the escalating tensions in the Middle East, and they will also explore whether Iran's nuclear program will be used for peaceful purposes or not. I'd not expect these talks to lead to meaningful progress to end this conflict, but they are likely a pursuit by the Europeans to understand more of what is unfolding in this conflict. We could see more news emerge on the status of Iran's nuclear weapons pursuits. And we are currently receiving conflicting information on that front, so any news that emerges could be helpful. A big question that emerges in the aftermath of the cancelled 6th talk between the United States and Iran is how much of a role the United States played in Israel's initial attack on Iran last week. Before the talks were cancelled, it could surely be assumed that the United States fully intended on attending these 6th talks. Or alternatively, the United States could have known that the talks were already doomed, and so they approved the Israeli attack. Or did the Israelis not seek approval at all, and they launched the attack because the timing suited them? Netanyahu has since revealed that the United States did know about Israel's attack plans in advance. This would lead me to conclude that either the United States knew that these talks were doomed, and they approved this Israeli attack on Iran, or the United States didn't approve the attack, but the Israelis did it anyway. Despite how much the United States knew and how much they were involved, tensions are now unlikely to improve between the United States and Iran. And although Donald Trump does continue to mention potential negotiation I currently don't see that the conditions are there unless Iran is forced into such a deal. The biggest news over the last few days has been that Trump is considering more active US involvement in this conflict. Once again, it's moves such as this that solidify this environment of escalation that we currently remain in. So, how could potential US involvement in this conflict unfold from here? Initially, in the aftermath of the first Israeli attack, the position of the United States was difficult to judge. Marco Rubio had stated that the United States was not involved in the strikes, but they were clearly helping to defend Israel. Also, the United States had been evacuating personnel from its embassies in the Middle East, a clear sign that they knew something was coming and had advanced warning of this Israeli attack, which Netanyahu later confirmed. At first, Trump was also confused about how to play this latest escalation in the Middle East. He had been pushing for peace as a key part of his second-term pursuits, but he has overseen the opposite. We've seen escalation in the Middle East, and there is no peace in Ukraine. Trump seemed convinced initially that Israel and Iran could make a deal, even after this conflict started, as we saw via a post he made on Truth Social. However, Trump's stance has seemingly changed in the last few days. He is now considering direct involvement against Iran. This change could have come in the aftermath of the Ayatollah's speech, in which he said that Iran, quote, would never surrender. This could also be a strategy by Trump to attempt to get Iran to negotiate, but this seems unlikely given the escalatory environment that we find ourselves in. So, has Trump's potential and his openness to get involved here put him in a difficult position? Even more importantly, is this the position that the Israelis wanted to put Trump in? Let me explain. It's clear that Israel has too much incentive for this war to continue, and so it will. Netanyahu's own personal career and having to face his corruption trial if his coalition collapses ensures that personally he needs war with Iran, and it will stay this way until the war has been deemed successful. Success in the eyes of the Israelis would involve limiting Iran's nuclear capabilities. As we saw from the nuclear talks between the United States and Iran, it's clear that they also want the same thing, to limit Iran's nuclear capabilities. But in this environment that we're now in, which is an environment of all-out war, a deal is incredibly unlikely unless Iran is pushed towards a deal out of weakness or for the survival of the Iranian regime. As a result of no deal likely occurring, if the United States wants to weaken Iran's nuclear ambitions, it too has no choice but to see that this war continues until this does occur. So, by launching this first attack, Israel has upended what chance there was of a deal occurring between Iran and the United States, which I believe was a slim probability anyway. This has created an environment where the United States now needs to be involved in this conflict. The level of involvement is debatable, but the only way, without a deal, to limit Iran's nuclear industry with complete confidence is through bunker buster bombs that the United States possesses, but Israel does not. This is because some of Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities, namely the Fordo nuclear enrichment facility, is built under a mountain, 240 feet underground, and it is protected by reinforced concrete. Israel doesn't have the capability to destroy this, But for this war to be deemed a success, they will want to do this. The United States, however, does have the capability to destroy this facility. So whether the United States ends up directly involved in this Iran conflict or not, they are involved here, and they will continue to be as we move into the coming weeks and months. This episode today was going to conclude my discussion on this conflict between Israel and Iran, but there is still much more to discuss. So in next episode, which will likely come out on Tuesday, I will conclude this discussion by diving into the potential scenarios that we could see unfold in this conflict as we move forward. Until then, I've been Dylan. I'll talk to you next time.